Well, we're talking about theories. Something just came out on Yahoo. We could talk about it if we want to. You know who Stephen Hawking is? Hawking, generally considered one of the finest scientists. He's a cosmologist and has advocated the possibility of God in the past. But now he's come out in his latest book and says he doesn't think there is a God. From Reuters, it says God did not create the universe and the Big Bang was an inevitable consequence of the laws of physics. The new eminent British theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking argues in a new book. Because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. So he's basically arguing there's no room for God anymore. Science can explain it. Now, a couple things immediately happen when you read that. One, it's a theory. He's proposing a theory. Second, you'd want to ask, what's his credibility to do that? And he has very good credibility. He's one of the top cosmologists. Third, you want to ask, what caused him to change specifically? What kind of data did he do? What kind of research did he do that led him now to kind of reverse his position on God? Kind of interesting. At the point he's reversing his decision on God, you know that one of the greatest British atheists in the history of philosophy, Antony Flew, at the ripe old age of 80, came out and wrote that he now believes there is a God. Not the God of Christianity, but the God of Aristotle. He came to the precise opposite view Hawking's did. So anytime you propose a theory, you'd have to ask questions that we're asking in this class. We're going to talk about communication theories, but this is a theory that Hawking's now is presenting to people, and he will have to prove, very carefully define what he's talking about, and prove his theory with some kind of research, some kind of data, and all that kind of stuff. By the way, a nice move that postmoderns make, and our guest lecturer, I just confirmed, so excited, is coming on Tuesday. He's going to be here. He's coming in from Berkeley, and he's going to be with you all week. I'm just going to take the time off. Hockey season starts in 27 days, and I'm just going to spend time in intense prayer, because the Red Wings are really old, and we just need God's hand of protection. So he's going to be here for the entire week. One thing he's going to say is this. Hawking's he just doesn't sit in a vacuum and look at the evidence, right? Hawking's isn't this objective scientist. Postmoderns would say everybody has something to lose or gain with every direction they go. So they would argue that Christians also, it's not that you sit down and you go where the evidence takes you. It's just not true. If I were to reverse my position on God, what is one thing for sure would happen? I would lose my job. I could no longer teach at Biola. I'd have to find a new job. Kind of hard to do when your house is underwater financially. So postmoderns will say nobody's just driven by the pure rationality and objectivity. That really does not exist. And our guy, when he comes on Tuesday, is really going to push that point. Okay, so really excited. Do not miss that class. Hugely important for the test. It will be a handout for his 2 lectures. You don't want to miss it. It's going to be really a good time. Okay? So interesting theory. Now, we're talking about how do you construct a theory and the goals of theory, and then we're going to talk about how do you actually test a theory. People got theories about everything, on weight loss, on hair growth, on anything you can think of. People have theories that they want to say, I really believe in this theory, I really think it works. We're talking about how to construct a theory, the goals of a theory. Somebody want to tell me what the first goal of a theory is? What's the first goal of a theory? Yeah. Yeah, description. What are you talking about? Hawking has his idea of spontaneous creation. Well, we'd first want to say to him, would you mind defining that for us? And no doubt in his book, he will define that page after page after page. We'd want to take a hard look at define your terms. What do you mean by that? What's the second goal? Okay, explanation. Fine. You can say spontaneous creation happens. Remember the old adage, out of nothing, nothing comes? So how in the world did the universe spontaneously start without any first cause? And the first cause, we have argued, is God. So he'll have to explain, what do you mean by spontaneous creation? And no doubt he's going to do that in his book. The third part of a theory, and again, we're going to go back to Gottman, because I don't know. I exhausted all my knowledge on spontaneous creation. You got everything I have on that, okay? When somebody asks me about the COMM, cosmological argument, my response is, J.P. Moreland, could you come here for a second? Yeah. So we're talking about Gottman. What did Gottman say about marriage? Gottman said if one of four things were present, what was going to happen? Yeah, most likely divorce. He's in the 90th percentile. By the way, just for the heck of it, what are the four things Gottman mentioned? Won't be on your test. Yes? Contempt. Defensiveness. Stonewalling. Boy, that's a freebie worth the whole price of the course. Okay? Yes?
That won't be on our test.
I misspoke and it was taped. So I'm going to retract myself and say don't hold me to that. You should know that, one, because it could be on the test. Two, it's great life material. You need to read Gottman's book, Why Marriages Succeed, Why They Fail. It is brilliantly done. And until December, the best book on marriage I know of. Okay? All right, number three, goal is understanding. This is a combination of things. Number three, prediction and control. Theories allow us to understand something. Sure, everybody says that in the first 7 years, marriages are really prone to divorce. Everybody says that. Well, by arguing for the cycle of negativity, Gottman wants to understand why divorce is prevalent when those four things are present. But then there ought to be a certain amount of prediction. In other words, when he sees you arguing, and we could explain his whole methodology, it's kind of really wild in some ways. You agree as a couple to be a part of his study. Remember, his study was based on 5,000 couples. You go to what he calls the love lab, which is kind of cheesy. But you actually go to this place that is a constructed living room, and you and your spouse sit down. Now, you're completely wired. He's checking your heart rate, breathing, perspiration, and behind a mirror, he has a group of his experts who are categorizing every reaction. Now, you may ask, but wouldn't you know that? And if Noreen and I were asked to go and sit and we've got cameras rolling, I'm not going to have an argument with my wife. Come on, Noreen and I speak at family life marriage conferences, and when we're at the conference, we're not going to have an argument. Now, by the way, we've had arguments on the way to conferences and even have been slightly miffed at each other at a we've been doing it for 13 years. So slightly miffed at each other. But I remember one time walking out of the hotel room and saying to Noreen, hold my hand, it's our job. Okay? Which she actually laughed, okay? But walking out. So I know enough not to have an argument in front of people who are at a marriage conference and we're the speakers, okay? I have enough self-control. So you may say, do these people really argue on camera in front of Gottman? The answer is, oh yeah. Why? You filled out a questionnaire before you went there, and he just noted the areas to push your button. So everything's going along swimmingly until he says, well, mind if we talk about finances? Because your spouse put on his sheet that he kind of thought, yes, we struggle about finances because of my wife's undisciplined approach to money. And then your spouse is like, I'm what? Undisciplined? I would rather say I'm frugal. Oh, well, I would say cheap. That's rich coming from you. Okay, boom, Gottman goes, start the clock, that's my 5 minutes. That 5 minutes, if I see contempt, criticism, stonewalling, bingo, that's my 5 minutes. Okay, so if he sees it, he wants to predict it's going to happen. By the way, his love lab is a really controlled setting. Okay, I mean, you're part of an experiment. Okay, got to sign a bunch of waivers to be a part of that. Okay, so another goal of our theories is understanding it, predicting it, and controlling the environments. Because what would Gottman say if only one of them was present? What if only 2 of them were present. Could it be possible that if only criticism is habitually present and the others aren't present, will the marriage make it? Controlling the environment as much as possible. By the way, Gottman says of the 4 horsemen, while they're not all equal, he would say stonewalling is the most dangerous. He would argue if the least dangerous, which he would say is criticism, if that is habitually present, you will get a divorce. If any of the 4 are habitually present, you're headed toward a divorce. Very interesting. Okay? Now, the 4th goal, I'm going to put a star by it because it's controversial. Not all communication scholars believe this ought to be a goal of theory. Okay? So make sure you note that star. Reform is the goal of theory, but it's debated. Not everybody buys this. For example, by reform we mean that as an academic who's creating these theories, my goal is to actually transform not just the classroom, but transform society. See, we used to get the bad rap at a university that, listen, all we do is produce theory here. How you use the theory is up to you. Okay? I'm not concerned about that. I'm concerned about researching and producing knowledge. Now, again, another nice postmodern move is that a lot of postmodern academics are saying that's hogwash. I don't stop being a part of society just because I teach at a university. My goal is not only to create theory, but is to change society. And again, where I did my PhD, people were about changing society for the environment, for racial issues, gender issues. What I admired about my faculty at UNC Chapel Hill, they're not just interested in producing a bunch of knowledge and filling up your computers with information. They actually want to go and change culture. Now, we may disagree sometimes with how they want to change it, but a lot of academics today, particularly younger academics, really it is about social change. Now, as a Christian academic, I kind of think that's part of it. We are to be salt and light in culture, and the salt part is that we keep culture from going bad. So we do try to influence it for the kingdom of God. I don't think we make any bones about that. Now, it opens you up to this criticism, though, when you say, I do believe reform is one of the goals, is that you're tipping your hand that you're not neutral anymore. Right? If you belong to a liberal university like Berkeley, how you want to change the world, no doubt, is at points dramatically different from how Biola wants to change the world. So you're kind of tipping your hand. I don't mind that because it explodes the illusion that somehow when I walk through this door, I'm completely objective. I'm not. As a teacher, as a researcher, as an academic, I'm not completely objective. I think we can try to be objective on certain issues, but for the most part, we're not objective. Okay? Berkeley sees the world dramatically different than Biola sees the world. It does taint our research, and no doubt it taints our objectivity. So our goals, I think, are to reform, but not every academic would buy that. I need to be biased. So if you were to say to Hawking, do you think you're completely biased unbiased in this whole thing? I bet you he would say, as a scientist, yeah, I kind of am. And of course, postmoderns would laugh at that. You know, you put on that white lab coat, what does that mean? Right? It's just a color. You're not neutral. Okay, make sense? Okay, any questions about the goals of theory? Okay, now we get to an important part. Everybody's got a theory. Everybody. Everybody wants to say, I got a theory of how this works. I got a theory of how that works. We have to sit back as communication critics and ask the question, well, how do you actually test these theories? Well, here's how we test communication theories, but theories in general, okay? So the new section is, how do you test the theory? So we want to talk about testing a theory. Number one, we ask and by the way, these are all questions we ask. First question has to do with testability. Ask the question, is it testable? If you can't test it, not a theory. It's very difficult. So, can the claims advanced by the theory be investigated? Can the claims advanced by a theory be investigated? Why or why not? So, I had this great idea while I was at UNC Chapel Hill doing my master's, and that was, why not bring together the Christian community and the gay community and have them have a dialogue? Right? A culture war had broken out in Chapel Hill, and these two camps were going at each other in the paper, school paper, and even bleeding out into the News and Observer, the Raleigh paper. National Coming Out Week had happened, and Christian got really mad, angry, and wrote a letter to the editor of the campus newspaper. You better believe it got printed. And then, of course, somebody from the gay community sent a volatile letter in, and pretty soon you had all these letters going at each other and people angry and yelling at each other. Well, I had the idea, let's actually bring them together, 3 members of the gay community, 3 members of a very conservative Christian group on campus, and say to them, in week 5, you're going to talk about your differences. Give me 4 weeks to prepare you to have that conversation about differences. We were going to do empathy, perspective taking, all that kind of stuff. So you present that to a board of 5 professors at UNC Chapel Hill who have to sign off on it before you get to do it, especially when you're using human participants, okay? So so I get up there, I explain what I want to do eloquently, blah, 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 blah. Everybody goes, oh, great, great, great. First question, how will you know what you're doing works? Because you've got this now neat little 4-stage perspective taking thing you want to take them through. Sounds great, love it. But how will you know if it works? And I'm sitting there like, wow, that's a really good question. So I had to keep journals. Everybody kept a journal. I analyzed the journals. I videotaped certain parts of the discussion and came up with a criteria using thematic analysis to see whether people had moved from their initial position to more of an open position towards each other. First question for my 5 faculty members, how will you know if this works? Well, I don't know. They all seemed kind of happy, and a couple of them hugged each other. Okay, we all got invitations to a Christmas party. Okay, it's like, okay, that's not going to work. That's not going to fly. So I basically did a thematic analysis of their journals and their interactions that I had taped to see if major themes had developed over 4 weeks that were not present in their narratives when they started. Make sense? Well, you have to do that. If I can't test your theory, it's not a good theory. It's just not going to work. Okay? By the way, what makes what Hawking says so speculative, you can't reproduce the universe. You can't reproduce the start of the universe. So, just like the theory of evolution, just like the resurrection, by the way, because we can't reproduce the resurrection, we have to use historical inquiry to see if our theories about the resurrection are in fact testable. We argue that they are, and people attack us for saying that's not really a good test. Okay? So, testing it is incredibly important. By the way, can you buy homeopathic drugs that tell you that you'll grow 5 inches in a month? Can you buy that kind of stuff? That you'll lose 10 pounds in 10 days? Okay? You know, you actually can buy some of that stuff, but what's one thing that is not on the label when you buy it? Not on the label. Can't find it anywhere. Guaranteed. Oh, no, actually some make huge guarantees. Huge guarantees that this will work and you'll grow your hair back in a weekend. What's not on it?
An FDA approval.
And explain what the FDA is.
So that means it's gone through clinical testing for safety and actual effectivity.
Yeah. Fish oil. I take fish oil. I actually think it helps with my migraines. I had gotten severe migraines a couple years ago, and somebody came up and said, hey, my mom works for Shackley, and I told her about your migraines, and she actually has given you this fish oil. And I think the fish oil has really helped, but any fish oil, this is not FDA approved. It may help you. We're not saying it doesn't, but it's not been clinically proven that this thing actually helps you. Now, I do take another thing that has been approved by the FDA, and it's homeopathic. It's called Pedialex. And it has actually gone through clinical trials, not exhaustively, but actually the FDA will say it has gone through some trials and looks very promising. Okay? So it has to go through rigorous testing because, who knows what fish oil does, right? I have no idea. Though I used to be able to dunk before I took them, and now I can't dunk anymore. So testability is number one. Number two, scope. Ask the question, how much does the theory describe and explain? Scope. How much does the theory describe and explain? My theory has discovered the secret of all marriages. My theory focuses on all individuals in the northern part of the United States. Most times, people look at a theory and say it's too broad. You cannot write a dissertation about that. You cannot write a master's thesis about that. Your topic is way too broad. By the way, when you submit something for publishing, most times the editor comes back and says, I think what you're doing is really good, you've bitten off too much. Okay? By the way, that's the difference between academic writing and popular writing. Academic writing is always very narrow and on a very specific thing. Popular writing is, I've got a communication technique that'll work on your kids, your wife, your boss, and I've even seen it work on my dog. Okay? Because it's popular writing. The editor is going to look at you if this is a popular book on marriage and say, listen, they don't need to know all that. That's way too much information. It's bogging down. Because it's not an academic book, it's more of a popular book. Make sense? If you compare the God Conversation, which is a popular book on apologetics, to the second book Todd and I wrote called Authentic Communication, which is part of InterVarsity's academic press, you qualify everything. Right? Well, what do you mean by empathy? Well, by empathy, I mean blah, blah, blah. And I realize that some scholars argue that empathy is not even possible. I recognize that. But I still would argue. In a popular book, the editor is like, just say empathy. Just say it. We don't need to know about the whole. Most people buy it. You don't need to. Yeah, but I think we have to say that it comes from the Greek word. Don't need to know it comes from the Greek word. Most people know the English word. Okay, we're fine with the English word here. But, that's the difference between popular and academic writing. So in our theories in the academy, most likely people's theories are just too broad, covering way too much information here. Got to back off. Well, I decided I'm going to do my master's thesis on nonverbal communication. Okay, fine. That's a huge topic. What part of nonverbal communication are you going to create a theory about? See, it can't be too broad. Conversely, it could be too narrow. I'm going to take a look at blue-eyed evangelicals from the town of O'Keefe in Georgia. And it's like, okay, you might want to broaden that a little. That's really narrow. I'm going to take a look at blinking as a nonverbal. Okay, well, is there anything we can add to that? That seems so it can be too broad, but your theory also can be too narrow. So we ask the question, what is this trying to explain, your theory, and are you being way too ambitious with it? All right? Number 3. Is a really interesting one called Parsimony. It asks the question, is it appropriately simple? Is the theory appropriately simple? Most theorists believe that a simple theory is much better to take over a complex theory. The simpler your theory, it's just better to go that direction. Take the simple one over the much more complex one. Now, let me make an interesting Christian caveat on this. Parsimony is used both to prove the resurrection and disprove it at the same time. Non-Christian critics of the Christian worldview, using parsimony, would ask the question, what's the simplest theory about what happened at the resurrection? Is it simpler to believe that the disciples, for whatever reason, lied about Jesus coming back to life? Okay, I don't even need to know what the reason is. Maybe they wanted to start their own religion. Maybe they wanted power. Maybe it was a financial scam. I have no idea. But is it simpler to believe that a bunch of guys lied about a dead man coming to life, or is it simpler to believe that a dead man in fact came to life? Okay? Parsimony is used to attack the resurrection. Because on face value, what would be your answer to that question? What? Yeah, they lied. How often do dead men come back? Not very often. Okay, so I come home late from dinner. Honey, I know you said this was a special dinner. I know we were celebrating Michael's birthday. You will not believe what happened. What? Aliens. 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 I was transported to an alternate universe. I was actually there for 6 years, but in Earth, that comes out to roughly the time that I was late. 50 minutes. It's crazy. Crazy. So Noreen looks at me and says, applying parsimony, is it more reasonable to believe that Tim got caught up talking to Eric Tanis at Biola, or whatever reason, or in fact that he was hijacked by aliens? Applying parsimony, I'm going to go with, you were talking to Eric. Honey, no, it was an alien in the form of Eric. Okay, right? Applying parsimony, what do you go with? Now, Christians will argue the exact opposite using parsimony. They will say, is it more reasonable to believe that the disciples lied about the resurrection and started one of the greatest religious movements in the history of mankind, that they totally turned over the world, and it was all based on a lie? These men never saw the resurrected Jesus. They made that up. They were willing to die for a lie. They were willing to be martyred for a lie. And people didn't go to the tomb. The tomb was right there on the outskirts of Jerusalem. Nobody thought to go check this tomb. Right? Or is it more reasonable to believe that God resurrected Jesus? See? Now, the big theory breaker is, what's your perspective? Where is your perspective coming from? If I'm a naturalist and I don't believe in God, I don't believe in miracles, absolutely I'm going to go with the idea that they're lying. We're Christians. We believe in the supernatural. We have no problem with God doing miracles. And so it seems simpler to say that Jesus was resurrected. See how that works? So you're going to go back to prior commitments is going to help you evaluate every theory, saying, well, I have a bias towards evolution. I have a bias towards theism. Those biases really do shape how you take a look at a theory and even argue if it's simple or complex. Does that make sense? So that's why the postmoderns are pretty wise to say, hey, before I judge you, let me just hear a little bit about your background. Let me hear about how you grew up. What's your relationship to God or religion? I need to know a little bit more about you before I just believe you're sitting down with the facts and just coming to a decision based on pure facts and pure rationality. I think that's probably a really wise move. I think postmoderns go too far to say, I can't have any objectivity. Because again, Antony Flew at the age of 80, ruining his academic reputation. It'd be like C.S. Lewis right before he died saying, you know what, I kind of had a major shift in my thinking. I don't think I buy God anymore. Not C.S. Lewis. Well, Antony Flew messed with his reputation that he had spent all of his life creating. And he said, I did it because that's where the evidence took me. Now, I think he can marginalize some objectivity. All right, make sense? Number 4 asks a very interesting and practical question, and we call it utility. That asks the question, is this useful? So you come up with your theory, and you got to ask the question, well, is it useful? Well, John Gottman wins huge when it comes to utility. A lot of people have bought into Gottman's teachings. It has transformed relationships, made him healthier, and the people that he works with, he's had a good success rate of that those couples don't go towards a divorce. So your theory may be a great theory, but it's so theoretical or arcane that you think, well, what use is this? The ontological argument for God's existence, now we'll never show this to William Lane Craig. The ontological argument for God's existence is that there is none greater than that which I can't even do it. It's so complex of an argument that very few people, though a lot of people argue the ontological argument is a great argument, a lot of people say, but I can never do it. I can't even get my hands around it, nor can I present it to somebody. Okay? So it loses a little bit on utility. Number 5 is what we call heroism. And that asks the question, does it generate new thoughts? Does it generate any new thoughts? So heroism is the last one. It's kind of this interesting one of asking the question, does your theory cause me to think about things in a really fresh way? Well, let me brag on a local academic at USC. His name is Walter Fisher. And Walter Fisher came up with, probably in the 70s, something called narrative theory. He argued that even more persuasive to a person is statistics, data, raw logic. Even more persuasive than any of that is just a good old-fashioned story. Fisher argued that we are homo narrans, we're human narrators, that we make sense of our lives because we narrate them. Because we're homo narrans, when we hear a good story, it will persuade us more than all the statistics you could think of. Well, you know what? There are people who argue that narrative theory has gone too far, but everybody, when he came out with narrative theory, everybody was like, wow, what an interesting way to think about things. So are people primarily narrative-based, or are they primarily motivated by surveys, statistics, and all that raw data? Well, you know what? It transformed every branch of the academic institution. By the way, as Christians, we'd want to say, yeah, I think narrative theory, there's something to it. I find it fascinating that in Luke 15, when Jesus is being pressed on the fact does God really love sinners, because people are bugged that he's hanging out with sinners, in Luke 15, Jesus responds to this claim, does Jesus really love sinners? And do you remember his 3 greatest stories he tells in Luke 15? Who can name them? Probably, well, for sure, his greatest story of all time, but he also told 2 lesser stories to prove to people God really does love sinners. Anybody remember what those 3 stories could be? Yes?
One of them's with the guy who was forgiven for his debt by his boss. That one?
Yeah. I don't even know if that's in Luke 15, but what a great another story by Jesus. Okay? Anybody remember? He shares them all in a row. Starts with 2 lessers, and then he gets to probably what is his most famous story. Yeah, prodigal son for sure is his last one. Okay? And by the way, we even use that term now, prodigal, the prodigal. Even non-Christians use that term. Yeah. Lost coin, right? A woman loses her coin. She turns up the entire house to find the coin. She lights every lamp, and she looks for the lost coin. What's the next one? Lost sheep. Okay? Man leaves the 99, looks for the 1. And then he talks about the prodigal. I find it fascinating that Jesus responds, not in straight proposition. He responds, but let me tell you 3 stories. And then obviously the culmination of that is, I'm coming to look for you. And so I don't hang out with the religious, I hang out with the lost. I think it's fascinating. And you could do narrative theory with the entire New Testament. So, while not everybody buys the full import of narrative theory, there's not a person in communication theory who does not know what narrative theory is, and everybody applies it to everything from the Anita Hill confirmation hearings, narrative theory, to how politicians sell their point. Every politician is going to get up and do a couple things. One, Barack Obama is going to get up and tell you a bunch of statistics, but he will always conclude it with a story. When he's given the State of the Union address, what does he do? Bunch of stories, then he has a Marine stand up. He says, let me tell you about that Marine right there. Let me put a face on Afghanistan. That sergeant right there, right? Narrative theory. By the way, jury selection is now based on narrative theory. What kind of stories do you need to tell jurors to move them emotionally and intellectually? So, huge points for heroism. By the way, postmodern theories like deconstructionism, you can't graduate from a university and not know what deconstructionism is, right? Deconstructing Westerns, what color is the bad color in a Western? What?
Red.
Okay. Say it again.
Red.
Red? Okay, black is traditionally it. In billiards, what's the one color of the ball you knock it in a pocket, you immediately lose? Black. Okay? Deconstructionists would say, now you really think it's just that easy? White is good and black is bad? How did we get to this idea that black is a bad color? So let's deconstruct billiards and American Westerns to see how they feel about women and colors. Now, you may look at that and say, I think that's crazy. But boy, did you get me thinking about that for a second. Okay? Huge heroism benefit. Deconstructing cheers at a high school football game. Sexist nature of cheers and how they demean women. Right? Interesting. So everybody knows a little bit about deconstructionism. Why? It generated so many great thoughts. But you better believe the Bible's deconstructed, right? The writings of Paul, deconstructed from a feminist lens. Okay? Very interesting. Okay? So does this make sense? I love seeing the note cards, by the way. I'm almost getting emotional seeing these note cards. This is just a beautiful moment in education. Okay? Because this is a very important list. And you already had a list that said, what are the goals of theory? Right? And then you had a definition of what theory was. Then you had a definition of what communication was, and I actually broke it down into different parts. Okay, make sense? Good job, guys. You're going to crush this test, okay? Now we're going to get to the 3 building blocks of every good theory. Remember I said with Hawkins, it'd be interesting to hear about his prior commitments? Well, every single person who builds a theory has to answer 3 basic questions before they actually create their theory. Now let's talk about what those 3 building blocks are. This will perfectly set up our guest lecturer on Tuesday. So, 3 building blocks that you have to work off of. It serves as the foundation as you're trying to construct a theory. Building block number 1. Is, what is your view of human nature? What's your view of human nature? We call this ontology, which is what is the essence of something. What's the essence of something is its ontology. So when we talk about human nature, we want to answer this question, and we're going to have 2 ends of a spectrum, okay? This is running out of... Watch this, watch this. All right. Oh, and this doesn't have a cap. Aha! Watch, this doesn't have a cap. All right. Thank you. Who said North Carolina? Who said Hey, what did I just say about postmodern commitments? When I'm grading your test, it's not the subjective, purified, rarefied moment. Okay? So, on this end, you have determinism. On this end, you have free will. Now, We're not talking about this in theological concepts. We're talking about it, what's your human nature. Obviously, we could get into a huge theological conversation. We're not. So determinism on this end is the belief that your actions have already been determined by mostly the environment you live in. Okay, your actions have been determined, or we could use the word governed, by forces outside of your control. So actions have been governed by forces that are outside of your control. Now, let me just illustrate that for a second, where people would get this idea. First, I have a friend of mine who speaks for Bill Glass Ministries, which primarily goes into prisons and even maximum security prisons. My friend is a ventriloquist, and he goes and does entertainment for these guys and actually shares the gospel when he's in there. So he remembers going with Bill Glass, and Bill Glass giving a talk and asking everyone in the audience, raise your hand if you had a father who told you you were no good and one day would wind up in prison. Raise your hand. According to my friend, easily 98% of the people raised their hand. Every hand went up when Bill Glass was talking to this one particular group. But think about that. You grow up in a home where your father looks at you and says, you're no good, and one day you're going to wind up in prison. And, by the way, your dad may have done prison time himself. You grow up in a home where you watch your father abuse your mother. Do you know for men, roughly 80% of men who abuse their wives say they watched their dad abuse their mom. So growing up in that environment, are we shocked that a man goes to prison or that he abuses his wife growing up in that kind of context? I remember a cartoon I saw of an Afghanistani elementary school where kids are going through this Afghan school run by the Taliban, and in it they get two things. They get a Quran and they get a book called America is Evil, subtitled Terrorism for Children. Now, it's a cartoon, but what if you grew up every day hearing that the great devil of the world is the United States, and the best thing you can do for this radical form of Islam is to strike down the devil? Would it be any shock that a child growing up in that environment turns out to be a terrorist? Right? Let me give you another one. Now, I created a course with a professor at UNC Chapel Hill. The course is on hate speech. Fascinating to study. Looking at a website called Ku Klux Klan for Kids. It was a tutorial of how to parent your child based on the values of the Klan. In this, I saw one photograph that's a very famous photograph on a series on racism. It has a picture of a young girl. This is probably 1920s, maybe 1910. She's dressed up in a Sunday dress. She's at a picnic. She's pointing to something and laughing. So when you see this exhibit, you just see the first part of the picture first. When you click on it, it shows you what the whole photograph was. Here's a little girl, probably 8, 9 max, laughing, pointing at something at a picnic. Now, you probably think it's a piñata. Click on it, and there's a picture of an African-American man who has been hung. And she's pointing to it, laughing. Now, you think, where in the world did that girl get any idea that that was funny? Well, she grew up in a racist home. Is it any surprise that she adopts the values of her parents and, in fact, has become racist and callous to the fact that a man has been hung? See, those who argue for determinism say where you grew up, the social economic place you grew up, deeply impacted how you see the world. And for some of you, you never had a chance. By the way, this defense is often used in a court of law to say, yes, my client killed this person, but they grew up in a crack home. They had never had a stabilizing father presence. They immediately had to join a gang to survive. And that's why, yes, he pulled the trigger and killed that man. Let me tell you why he did that. Now, the counter to that argument is, absolutely, the environment shapes your actions. Absolutely. Nobody on this side would say that a person growing up in a crack home with parents who are absent, being part of a gang, absolutely that shaped how they see the world, no doubt. But even within that, the human spirit has the ability to counteract that. Okay? Virginia Woolf wrote a phenomenal essay called A Room of Her Own, where she argues that one of the reasons women are not creative as men is because they don't have a room to themselves. Now, if you think about that, you think of things that Dad has. He has a garage that has all of his tools. He has a den that he can go into and just kind of close the door and be away from everything. He has a smoking room that he goes to. Virginia Woolf argues, what do women have? They have a laundry room. They have the kitchen. They only have places where they are to be productive, not creative. Even arguing that, she says, but yet some women resisted against that and were incredibly creative. They knew they were in a really tough place, and yet they were incredibly creative to create that place in a culture that denied them space. Argument also made when ladies, you didn't have the right to education. How women still taught themselves and resisted that kind of environment. So, I've given you the radical extremes of these, determinism on this end, free will there. Most communication theorists, or theorists in general, probably are not die-hard 100% anything. Most likely, it's a combination of things. I'm kind of here with a strong leaning towards determinism. I'm over here with a strong leaning towards free will. Nobody, seldom, is just radical free will or radical determinism. You kind of got to make that determination. How do I view human nature? Okay, it'll radically change how you construct an environment to carry out your very tests that you want to do. Okay? Second building block. Okay, building block number 2. Ways of knowing. Building block number 2. Ways of knowing. For 10 million bonus points. If you get this question right, I think you probably can safely not even take the first test. Because you'll have 10 million. Did I say billion or million? Trillion bonus points. What is the philosophical name when we talk about ways of knowing? What's the philosophical term we use? 10 trillion bonus points. Never mind is not right. Epistemology. Buddy, I think you could have a date with anybody in this room right now. Seriously. Can I just borrow 100,000 bonus points? I'll get out, you know what I mean? Just, Adrian, go for it. All right, here we go. Block number 2. Ways, I need to remember I'm being taped. Ways of knowing, okay? So, on one end, again, is what we call objectivism. Objectivism. On the other end is something we're going to call social constructionism. So, objectivism. And we've already talked about this a little bit. Objectivism is the idea that you can come to a place as a researcher or even as an individual where you can be objective. You can be completely objective. Okay? So, is there any truth to evolutionary theory, Darwinian evolution? Is there any truth to that? This view would hold that even though you're a committed Christian, and even though you kind of can read the handwriting on the wall saying if Darwinian evolutionism is true, then most likely I can't hold to my Christian worldview as I presently have constructed it. This view is saying you still can sit down and be totally objective about Darwinian evolution, even if it means you're going to walk away from your faith if it's true. So you can pick up Sam Harris's book, Letter to a Christian Nation, in which he attacks Christianity, or Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, where he argues that religion actually is very damaging and we need to eradicate it from the world. This view is arguing that you can actually take that book, sit down, and be objective, even if it means this could mean me walking away from Christianity. That view argues you can be objective, and that people mostly are objective when it comes to certain issues. Okay? By the way, in researching the first book, The God Conversation, I quote one scientist who says, a lot of us are closed to intelligent design because we know it carries with it the God implication. That if we recognize intelligent design in the cosmos of the world, right behind that is the God implication. And we're just not going to open that door. It was a really honest moment of saying, I can see where this thing's going to go. I don't want to go there. So we're not going to go there. Okay? But other people say, no, you can be objective no matter what the issue is, right? So you and your boyfriend or girlfriend sit down and you have that talk, you know, that wonderful talk, that let's define this thing talk. And he says to you ladies, I'm not sure we're good for each other. I mean, in some ways we're really good for each other, but do you think we're really good for each other? Like, you're sitting there going, I love you. I may kill you right now. But you say what? When he presents that to you, how do you respond? Well, you know what? Let's talk about it. Because, I just want what's best for both of us. Right? And I think maybe we should even pray about this. Ask the Lord. Inside you're going, I'm wonderful and you're a moron if you can't see that. And I really love you. I've committed like 1.5 years in this thing. Right? Well, objectivism is that you can actually sit down and say, I'm going to be objective about this. Okay? On the opposite end is social constructionism, which argues a bunch of different things. One, it argues that you really are driven not just by self-interest, but by power. Social constructivists will argue Nietzsche was pretty much right. Power is everything. And every decision that is made, there's a power implication involved. Every single time somebody makes a decision, part of that decision is what kind of power can be derived from it. People are not objective. They are moved by their passions, their self-interests. They're also moved in powerful ways by the environment by which they grew up. That definitely warps their objectivity. Okay? So, if I walked into Jeremy's elementary school, actually he just started junior high, this is his second day. But if I walked into his elementary school, or even junior high, and sat down, boys and girls, today, I'm going to talk about the merits of communism. What? Why are you laughing? Let's talk about the merits of communism. Right? Everybody would be like, that's a loser way to, you gotta get it. No, let's talk about socialism. Get out of here. Why are you not open to that? Because it's bad. Why is it bad? Because my teacher says it's bad. My pastor says it's bad. Everybody says it's bad. Have you studied it? No. Why? Because it's bad. Wow, guys. Holy cow. You know what I mean? So you go to Lithuania, sit down with Lithuanians and you say, I want to talk to you about God. They laugh. Why? Stalin purged Lithuania. If you were male and had any kind of academic degree, you're off in the gulags. If you said you believed in God, you're off in the gulags. So these college students, who are very bright college students, when you sit down and say, well, let's talk about God, they're like, God? That's what a grandmother believes in, because there's a huge glut now of intellectuals. So they're not open to God because that's what old ladies believe in. And you say, really? Yeah, oh yeah. Well, let's talk about, yeah, but I'm not going to believe in an old lady religion, right? So their objectivity has greatly been compromised by a social construction of what's a valid thing to believe in, what's not a valid thing to believe in, right? Okay, does that make sense? Now again, well, now, can you find radicals on both ends? Yeah, absolutely. In the literature, you can find radicals representing both ends of that continuum. Again, my professors at UNC Chapel Hill, you wouldn't find radicals here, okay? At UNC Chapel Hill, you see people who see the benefits of social constructionism. By the way, I do too. If you take my gender class, a lot of it is through a social constructivist grid. Ladies, you are denied the right to vote in this country. Why? Not because of your intelligence, because of cultural view of you. Okay? So, yeah, there are some really good things about social constructionism. Now, are there radicals who say it's all socially constructed? Yeah, but a lot of people would view them as kind of being radicals. I mean, I don't think any of us would say everybody's just as absolutely 100% objective about everything. No, we have passions, beliefs, prejudices, okay? So you have to make this determination in your mind, though. How objective can people be, and how much have they been influenced by a social constructivist view? All right, does that make sense? Foundational thing you're going to have to decide before you move on with your study. Okay? By the way, I had to make that determination with the participants. I had to say, is it possible for these individuals to set aside their passions, beliefs, prejudices enough so that they could actually enter the world in a community that they believed was morally wrong? Okay, gays and Christians. Okay? If I didn't think they could do that, why even do the study? Well, I believe that they could garner enough objectivity to make it worthwhile. Can they get rid of their objectivity and get rid of their prejudices? No, I wasn't asking them to do that. But I had to kind of make a determination, how much is it possible to ask a evangelical Christian to set aside all your biases about this belief system to at least enter into the world of a person from a different faith community or a different moral community. Make sense? Okay, the last one is why we're going to bring in our social constructionist on Tuesday because he's definitely over here. But the last building block is also another really interesting one. And this is where things kind of get contentious within the university. Well, for sure this one can be contentious as well. But this is the one where you really get some interesting arguments. Okay? And that is, what is the purpose of a theory? What's the purpose of a theory? Again, you have a continuum. On this side of the continuum is the idea that all that a theory can produce is what we'd call rules. Over here, you would have theorists who would say the purpose is to uncover laws. Okay? What's the difference? Rules most likely will apply to a particular community in a particular location. We're not saying that all men are like this. We're saying that some men are like this, depending on geographical considerations, based on where your socioeconomic distinctions. So we're generally saying rules would be, generally speaking, though not true for everybody, I would say that perhaps men are more oriented when it comes to friendship to be side by side. We like to do things with each other. Women, generally speaking, though not true for everyone, would be that women are face to face. That's how they develop intimacy. All you're doing is rules. These are general guidelines. They are not true for everybody. They don't apply to everybody. Okay, make sense? On the opposite side is to say, well, aren't there laws in the world? That would be a truth that is true for every single man in the world, regardless geographically you have been born, regardless of your historical context, regardless of any prior anything. We can say this is true of all men, this is true of all women, and this is true of all human beings. Okay? We call that a law, not a rule. When C.S. Lewis, in the beginning of Mere Christianity, talks about the law of human nature and applies it to morality, he says all human beings have this moral compass, he calls it the Tao, that everybody is aware of. It's a law of human nature. It applies to everyone. People in the 1900s, people today, people in the 1200s. Doesn't matter. People over here would say, you can't say that. All you can say is, for my community, based on what I've seen, here's a rule. It doesn't apply to everybody. If it applied to everybody, we'd call that essentializing. We're saying that all human beings have this essential characteristic. These people would say, you just can't do that. Okay? So, what are the laws that we would argue here at Biola? What are the laws that we would buy into? What are things that are true of all human beings?
We're sinners.
Okay, we're sinners. Are some sinners and some not? No. Everybody, because of the fall, that's true of everybody. What else?
We're created.
Oh, very interesting. Created in the image of God, all of us carry the Imago Dei. Okay? By the way, that's huge. That's a huge law. So what's great about that law is I can go to New Delhi, India, and talk to a street person, a woman who is devalued by her particular culture, and I say to that woman, you have been made in the image of God. You have just as much value as any man in any Western context. You are of value. Okay, I can say that to everybody. Why? It applies to everybody. Okay? This view, are there some things that are wrong for everybody and some things that are right for everybody? What would we say at Biola? Yeah, there are some things that are wrong for everybody. Okay? Over here, it's like, I see why you would want to say that. Okay? And I want to say that at times. But if a person grows up in a culture, and this culture has rules, and they have traditions, how can we then say that their rules are wrong because we're judging them by our rules? They would not grant you that. Okay, a very famous phrase. One group's terrorist is another group's freedom fighter. So it's all going to come down to here, we just can't make these grand pronouncements. So is there truth? Yes, but that truth is always with a small t. Always. Over here, yeah, there's small truth. Absolutely. But it's all based on a foundation of truth. Some things are true for everybody. Okay? By the way, when our social constructivist gets here, you need to be aware of this distinction. And you need to push them a little bit maybe on that distinction. Okay? So does this make sense? This one is where you get people raising their voices towards each other. Okay? Because one of the worst things that could happen, and it did happen, is what we call colonialism. Colonialism was this idea that one group of people took their laws and went to another group of people and said, to be civilized, you must do this. And it's like, well, why are you judging me with your Western, Eurocentric rules? Well, they're not rules, they're laws, and everybody to be civilized needs to dress this way, think this way. You need to speak the king's English, because you're savages if you don't. Okay? So colonialism was an abuse of this idea, I have the truth, and I'm going to enlighten everybody else. That's kind of scary today in some ways. But do you still want to argue the fact that there are some things that are true for everybody? There's some things that are true about everybody. Well, that gets to be a really interesting academic debate. Okay? Are you going to say something?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
I was
yeah,
just
yeah.
thinking. So that would mean that, so you could still believe that some things are true, but you could be further down along the line, heading toward, or do you have to be on either one end or the other?
No, this absolutely is both as well. Now, how could you ever conflate the two? Well, you could say this. Oh, here's a good one. Here's a good one. Masculinity, femininity. Is it all socially constructed? Because ladies, you go to Europe. We lived overseas for a year, and here's a perfectly attractive woman at a hostel we're staying, and she goes to comb her hair, and she's got hair underneath her arms, and you're just like, wow, I think I'm a fairly open-minded person, but wow, really? Okay? Now, I think all of us would agree that's a rule, not a law. Right? A woman can be perfectly feminine, perfectly attractive, and have hair on her legs and under her arms. I think we'd all would say that's a rule. Okay? But people over here would say, but everything you say about femininity is a rule. Virtually everything about a woman has been socially constructed. Everything. Others would say, no, but I think there's something that's true of all women that makes them feminine. There's something true about, now we know about masculinity, right? That it can fluctuate. Absolutely it can fluctuate. You don't have to be wanting to see action killer horror movies. A man can do things that may even seem feminine in nature, but they're still a man. They're still masculine, right? So holding the truth doesn't mean you can't believe that there are definite rules in life that are not laws. They're rules. Okay? So you can conflate the two. Over here, though, they will not say it's mostly truth with just a handful of laws. These people will say, and if you push it hard enough on this side, they're going to most likely say, oh, I think my academic stance is there's no laws, but in my personal life, I think there are some laws. Let me give you, for instance, I have some really good friends who would say oppression is always wrong. And I would say to them, always wrong? Doesn't matter what time of history, doesn't matter geographically where. The Taliban, though growing up in a Taliban culture, treat a woman like a dog, oppress them, that is wrong? And they would say, yes, that's wrong. Always wrong? Is there ever a good situation where a man can beat a woman? They would say, no, it is always wrong. I look at them and say, well, that's what I mean by a law. To me, it's a transcendent truth. Transcends culture. Make sense? They would say, privately, I think I buy that. Philosophically, I reject it. Really? Yeah. Publicly, in my academic writing, what I teach, I have a really hard time with that position. I really do. I don't think it works. But I have one or two issues that I really do believe are true for everybody. And you're like, oh, I need to know how that works, because that does not seem consistent. And they'll argue, well, I don't even know what to say about that. Okay? Make sense?
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.